It was one of those crisp, sunny mornings where the air felt fresh and the world seemed full of possibilities. Marcus Johnson stood at the edge of the quiet suburban street, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. He took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. This was it, the house he'd worked his entire life for. A sprawling two-story home with a wraparound porch and a neatly trimmed lawn. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything he'd overcome. Marcus had grown up in a rough part of the city where dreams often got swallowed by the harsh realities of life. But he'd always been different, determined, ambitious. He'd worked 3 jobs to put himself through college, saved every penny, and invested wisely. Now at 35, he was a successful entrepreneur, and this house, this beautiful, peaceful house, was his latest achievement. He'd paid for it in cash, a fact that still made him smile with pride. The neighborhood was picture perfect, the kind of place you'd see in a magazine. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, and the faint smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. But as Marcus walked toward the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way the curtains in the house next door twitched as he passed, or the older woman who stood on the porch, glaring at him like he didn't belong. He brushed it off. Today was supposed to be a good day. He was here to inspect his new property, to imagine the life he'd build here. But as he stepped onto the driveway, the woman from the porch stormed toward him, her face twisted in anger. Marcus froze. He wasn't sure what was coming, but he could feel the tension crackling in the air like a storm about to break. Little did he know, this encounter would change everything. Marcus had barely taken 2 steps onto the driveway when he heard the sharp, shrill voice cutting through the calm morning air. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" He turned to see the woman from the porch marching toward him, her face flushed with anger. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a floral housecoat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes narrowed as she approached, and Marcus could already feel the hostility radiating off her. "Good morning," Marcus said politely, forcing a smile. "I'm just here to... "I don't care what you're here for," she snapped, cutting him off before he could finish. "This is private property. You can't just wander around here like you own the place." Marcus blinked, caught off guard by her tone. He held up a hand, trying to calm her down. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm the new..." "Don't ma'am me," she barked, her voice rising. "I know your type, always lurking around like looking for trouble. Well, I'm not having it. Get off my property before I call the police." Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but he kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just bought this house and I came to..." "Bought this house?" she interrupted with a scoff, her lips curling into a sneer. "Yeah, right. Do you think I was born yesterday? People like you don't just buy houses in neighborhoods like this. Now, I'm not going to tell you again. Leave." Her words stung, but Marcus refused to let her see how much they affected him. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Look, I understand your concern, but I'm not lying. I have the paperwork right here. If you just let me explain." "I don't want to hear your excuses," she shouted, stepping closer and pointing a finger at him. "You think you can just waltz in here and take whatever you want? Not on my watch. I'm calling the police." Before Marcus could respond, she pulled out her phone and started dialing. He stood there, stunned, as she glared at him like he was some kind of criminal. He wanted to explain, to show her the documents in his hand, but she wasn't giving him a chance. "Yes, police? There's a man trespassing on my property," she said into the phone, her voice dripping with disdain. "He's refusing to leave, and I feel threatened. Please send someone right away." Marcus's heart sank. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. He'd come here to celebrate a milestone, to envision his future in this house. But now he was being treated like a criminal, all because of the color of his skin. As the woman hung up the phone, she crossed her arms again, her expression smug. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice low and venomous. "They'll deal with you." Marcus clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. But he knew arguing with her would only make things worse. So he stood there, waiting, as the tension in the air grew thicker by the second. Little did the woman know, the truth was about to come crashing down on her in the most unexpected way. The sound of sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus's stomach churned as he watched the police cruiser pull up to the curb. Two officers stepped out, their expressions stern as they approached. The woman immediately pointed at Marcus, her voice shrill and accusatory. "That's him," she exclaimed. "He's been trespassing on my property, and he refuses to leave. I told him to go, but he just stood there, intimidating me." Marcus's heart pounded as the officers turned their attention to him. He raised his hand slightly, trying to appear non-threatening. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not trespassing. I just bought this house, and I was here to—" "Save it," one of the officers interrupted, his tone cold. "We'll handle this." Before Marcus could say another word, the other officer stepped behind him and grabbed his wrists. Marcus's breath hitched as cold metal clamped around them. Handcuffs. He couldn't believe this was happening. "Wait, you don't understand," Marcus protested, his voice rising. "I'm the owner of this property. I have the paperwork right here." The woman scoffed, crossing her arms. "Don't listen to him. He's lying. People like him always have some excuse." The officers didn't even glance at the documents Marcus was trying to show them. Instead, they began leading him toward the cruiser. Marcus's face burned with humiliation as he noticed neighbors peeking out from behind curtains or standing on their porches, watching the scene unfold. "Please," Marcus said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Just let me explain. I'm not a criminal. I bought this house fair and square. I can prove it." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers opened the back door of the cruiser and guided him inside. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. How could this be real? He'd worked so hard to get here, to build a life where he wouldn't be judged by the color of his skin. And yet, here he was, being treated like a common criminal in front of everyone. As the cruiser door slammed shut, Marcus leaned his head back against the seat, his chest tight with frustration and anger. He thought about all the times he'd been underestimated, all the times he'd had to prove himself just to be seen as equal. And now, even after achieving so much, he was still being treated like he didn't belong. The woman stood on the sidewalk, her arms still crossed, a smug look on her face. Marcus clenched his jaw, fighting back the urge to yell, to demand justice. But he knew it wouldn't do any good. Not here. Not now. The officers got into the front seat, and one of them radioed in their status. "We've got the suspect in custody, heading back to the station." Marcus's heart sank. The station? This was spiraling out of control. He couldn't believe he was being arrested for simply standing on his own property. The injustice of it all made his blood boil, but there was nothing he could do. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, Marcus caught a glimpse of the woman in the rearview mirror. She was smiling, as if she'd just won some kind of victory. It made him sick to his stomach. But just as the cruiser reached the end of the street, a black SUV turned the corner and came to a sudden stop, blocking their path. The driver's door opened, and a man in his 60s stepped out, his face a mix of confusion and concern. Marcus recognized him immediately. It was the former owner of the house. "What's going on here?" the man demanded, striding toward the cruiser. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly caught off guard. "Sir, we're handling a trespassing situation. Please step aside." "Trespassing?" The former owner repeated, his voice rising. "That's Marcus Johnson. He's the man who just bought the house from me, paid cash for it too. What on earth are you doing arresting him?" The officers froze, their expressions shifting from confidence to uncertainty. The woman's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock. Marcus felt a surge of relief as the former owner approached the cruiser. "Let him out right now," the man said firmly. "This is ridiculous." The officers hesitated for a moment before one of them reluctantly opened the door and removed Marcus's handcuffs. Marcus rubbed his wrists, his eyes locked on the woman. She looked pale, her earlier confidence completely shattered. The former owner turned to the officers, his tone sharp. "You should be ashamed of yourselves. Arresting a man on his own property without even hearing him out?" The officers mumbled apologies, their faces red with embarrassment. They quickly got back into their cruiser and drove off, leaving Marcus standing there, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, relief, and disbelief. The woman, now visibly shaken, tried to stammer an explanation. I didn't know. I thought he was." But Marcus didn't let her finish. He had heard enough. It was time for karma to take its course. The woman's smug expression vanished, replaced by a look of shock and disbelief. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice trembling. He didn't say, I thought he was. You thought what? The former owner snapped, turning to face her. That he didn't belong here? That he couldn't possibly own a house in this neighborhood? Shame on you. The woman, now pale and visibly shaken, tried to stammer an apology. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I just thought. But Marcus held up a hand, cutting her off. Save it, he said coldly. I don't want to hear it. The former owner placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. I'm sorry you had to go through this, Marcus. It's unacceptable. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. He glanced at the woman, who was now wringing her hands nervously. The damage was done, and there was no taking it back. But as he stood there, the weight of the moment settling in, Marcus realized something. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for himself, for his dignity, and for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. And he knew exactly what he needed to do next. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself as he reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, the eviction notice he'd prepared just days ago as part of his transition into ownership. He hadn't expected to use it like this, but life had a way of surprising you. The woman was still standing on the sidewalk, her earlier bravado completely gone. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her housecoat tightly around her. She looked like a completely different person from the one who had been hurling insults just minutes ago. Marcus walked over to her, his steps deliberate and calm. He held out the notice, his expression unreadable. This is for you, he said, his voice steady but firm. She stared at the paper, her eyes wide with disbelief. What is this? She asked, though deep down she already knew. It's a notice to vacate, Marcus replied. You have 30 days to move out. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen, as the reality of the situation sank in. Then her face crumpled, and she began to plead. Please, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't know. I made a mistake. I'm so sorry. Please don't do this. Marcus looked at her, his gaze steady. You didn't just make a mistake, he said quietly. You judged me without knowing me. You treated me like a criminal because of the color of my skin. That's not a mistake. That's who you are. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. I can change, she whispered. I'll do better. Just give me another chance. But Marcus had heard enough. He'd spent his entire life fighting against people like her, people who saw him as less than because of how he looked. He wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. I'm not here to teach you a lesson, he said, his voice calm but firm. I'm here to live my life in my home without being harassed or humiliated. You brought this on yourself. With that, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her standing there, clutching the eviction notice like it was a death sentence. As he stepped onto the porch, Marcus felt a mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, but also a lingering sadness. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain of what had happened. Still, he held his head high, knowing he'd handled the situation with dignity and grace. The woman's desperate pleas faded into the background as Marcus unlocked the front door and stepped inside. This was his house now, his sanctuary, and no one was going to take that away from him. As Marcus stood in the doorway of his new home, he couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. It was a stark reminder that, despite how far we've come as a society, racism and prejudice still linger in the shadows, waiting to rear their ugly heads. But it was also a testament to the power of resilience, dignity, and standing up for what's right. This story isn't just about Marcus or the woman who wronged him. It's about all of us, how we treat others, how we judge people based on appearances, and how we react when faced with our own biases. It's a call to do better, to be better, because at the end of the day, kindness and respect cost nothing, but their absence can cost someone everything. Karma has a way of balancing the scales, but it's up to us to ensure that we're not the ones tipping them in the wrong direction. Marcus's story is a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find its way. And when it does, it's often served with a side of humility. So what can we take away from this? Treat everyone with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. You never know the battles they've fought or the mountains they've climbed to stand where they are today. And remember, your actions, good or bad, will always come back to you. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Marcus's shoes? How can we work together to create a world where stories like this don't have to happen? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that inspires, challenges, and sparks meaningful conversations. Thank you for watching, and remember, kindness is never wasted. See you in the next video.